Throughout the Battle of Stalingrad, one of the deadliest battles in world history, there were thousands of Red Army soldiers who were quickly and brutally executed by officers and commissars. It's believed that around 13,500 Soviet soldiers were executed during the battle for suspected disloyalty, cowardice and failure, and Stalin was insistent that not one soldier would take one single step back. Stalin was serious and had given officers instructions to be ruthless, and throughout the war he would even carry out a purge of the Red Army, which would significantly dent the strength of his army. But desertion as a crime throughout history was treated ruthlessly. For example, during the First World War, the British would execute using firing squads around 300 of their own soldiers for cowardice, in what was known as the shot at dawn executions. But what is the story of the horrific executions of the deserters of Stalingrad? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The Battle of Stalingrad saw some of the most horrific and ferocious fighting of the Second World War. There was a huge amount of close combat and direct assaults on civilians, and also air raids. It was the epitome of urban warfare and was the bloodiest battle of the conflict, and both the Soviets and the Germans suffered a huge amount of deaths and casualties. To begin with, following the launching of Operation Barbarossa, the Red Army were pushed back heavily by the Wehrmacht, and Stalingrad was of strategic importance for both sides. It was considered a major industrial and transport hub on the Volga River, and whoever held the city had access to the oil fields of the Caucasus and would also control the river. But the Germans would use the Luftwaffe to bomb the city heavily, reducing most of it to rubble, and street-to-street fighting would take place, and the fighting was incredibly tough and hard. During the winter, the conditions became horrific and the temperatures would plummet as low as -40 degrees Celsius, and because of this and the tough nature of the fighting, desertion or cowardice was prevalent. This was as many of the men had suffered shell shock or PTSD and had resigned themselves to the fact that the death was coming, on the horizon, and this had a huge negative effect on morale. Stalingrad in particular was known for its horrific fighting. This had a huge effect on those who fought, be it Soviet or German or Axis forces. One soldier would write, "When we got to Stalingrad, there were 140 of us, but by September the 1st, after 2 weeks of battle, only 16 remained. All the rest were wounded and killed. We don't have a single officer, and the non-commissioned officer had to take the command of the division. Up to 1,000 wounded soldiers a day are taken back to the rear from Stalingrad." Another would state that, "It is pure hell here. There are barely 30 men in the company. We've never been through anything like this. Unfortunately, I can't write to tell you everything. If fate allows it, I will someday tell you about it. Stalingrad is a grave for the German soldiers. The number of soldiers' cemeteries are growing." During the Second World War, desertion was a common problem inside of all the armies involved. This especially occurred when things were not going well for the armies. For example, desertion for the Allied forces at the start of the conflict was higher, and some soldiers would desert after they were greeted with the horrors of what was happening in the early stages of the conflict. Seeing soldiers fall all around them had a tough mental effect on the soldiers, but during the First World War, desertion and cowardice was dealt with much more brutally. The shot at dawn executions of World War I saw many of these men who were suffering mentally from the effects of combat being shot at an execution stake for these military offences. They were not allowed to defend themselves properly, or were not given the right to appeal once they were condemned to death. Also, there were many young soldiers who had joined up to the British Army underage who were also executed, but during World War II, the Allied mentality towards desertion had calmed down. If a soldier was said to have derelicted from their duties, or was found guilty of cowardice and desertion, then they would be dishonourably discharged, or would be imprisoned for a specific amount of time. The Allies also made more effort to encourage those back into the military. The Germans were not so allocating, as Hitler and his army generals deemed desertion as treason, one of the most shocking and horrific crimes of the conflict. He believed that this was a crime which was betraying the Third Reich and his empire, and because of this he would execute thousands of members of the military for this. Because of this, thousands of people were executed in some of the most horrific ways, as many were taken to prisons around Germany, where they lost their heads on the guillotine for betraying Hitler's Reich and the Nazi Party. Others were shot on firing ranges, or were executed by hanging on gallows. Some would even be sent to concentration camps for these offences, and many would be killed when they arrived there. But Joseph Stalin would also be incredibly brutal, and he would go further and would issue many orders, including one which became very famous for one line, "Not a step back." This was known as Order Number 227, and it was given by Stalin to make sure that each front had a number of punishment battalions established. Each was made up of 800 middle-ranking commanders accused of disciplinary problems, and many of these were said to have been involved in desertion or military offences. These men were seen as troublesome, and from 1942 to 1945, 422,700 Red Army soldiers were sent to these battalions following court-martial. It was said that, after the loss of Ukraine, Belarus, Baltic Republics, Donetsk, and other areas, we have much less territory, much fewer people, bread, metal, plants, and factories. We have lost more than 70 million people, more than 800 million pounds of bread annually, and more than 10 million tons of metal annually. Now we do not have predominance over the Germans in human reserves, in reserves of bread. To retreat further means to waste ourselves and to waste at the same time our motherland. Therefore it is necessary to eliminate talk that we have the capability endless to retreat, that we have a lot of territory, that our country is great and rich, that there is a large population, and that bread will always be in abundance. Such talk is false and parasitic. It weakens us and benefits the enemy. If we do not stop retreating, we will be without bread, without fuel, without metal, without raw material, without factories and plants, without railways. This leads to the conclusion, it is time to finish retreating, not one step back. Such should now be our main slogan. It was directed that there must be blocking detachments established at the back of each army, who would hang at the rear, and they would then shoot anyone who was said to have been a panic monger or a coward. In the first 3 months following the order, 1,000 soldiers were shot dead by these forces. The order was intended to increase morale and spirit, but for those in the Red Army at Stalingrad, it had a very detrimental effect. These were men fighting for their lives, but they knew that if they took a step back, they would be executed or shot. There was no way out for them, and it was clear that Stalin and the Soviet officials had little care for the lives of these men, and they were just a statistic on the battlefield. But during the Battle of Stalingrad, it's believed that 13,500 soldiers of the Red Army were executed for cowardice or desertion. Many of those were shot by soldiers at the rear, but because of the intense fighting, these men were scared of their impending deaths. Bodies lay all around the city, and for many it was too much, and they sought to hide out and escape the reality of the battle. But many would be executed by gunshot, and they would be hurriedly executed by commanding officers who would see the cowardice of men as a stain against Stalin and also the Soviet Union. They saw this as a disgrace against the men, women and children who had been slaughtered inside of Soviet lands by the rampaging Wehrmacht. The reality of the Eastern Front was one that was covered with bloodshed and would see millions lose their lives. But the executions of the deserters of Stalingrad wiped out enough soldiers for a division, and these could have been handy when times got tough. But the Red Army would eventually fight back regardless and would take the city, encircling the Germans and leading to the capitulation of the Sixth Army. But those 13,500 men of Stalingrad, who were executed by their own soldiers, are often forgotten and overlooked. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.